So, hi, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Alex Levitov. I'm a professor of medicine in East Virginia Medical School and have been a participant of 2012 expedition to study G-Tummo and was an advisory position with 2018 expedition for the same purpose. I will try to summarize the information that has been discovered during those two expeditions. I work as a clinical professor of medicine, basically a doctor. For most part, I was offered to study Tumo and was under full assumption that this practice is a hoax until I came and did some of the studies. My interest in medicine is ultrasonography, and a lot of the data that will be here presented will be presented in terms of clinical ultrasound. I have no disclosures. Unfortunately, there have been no attempts to corrupt me of lately. There's a nice little picture by the Russian painter Nicholas Roerich in 1932 depicting the practice of Tumo that we will talk about in a moment. So what is Tumo? The meaning is inner fire or she fire. It's an ancient Buddhist practice, and practitioners of that demonstrate incredible tolerance to low ambient temperature without ill effects that will occur in every person who will be exposed to that amount of time to that temperature. That is to say, there's no hypothermia. That would be a lethal complication of cold exposure or frostbites. As everything that came to the Tibetan plateau, it came from the plains of India, and it's somewhat based on the Hindu practice of Agnisara, though different from it, but being a physician, I would not further comment. There's a nice gentleman there attempting to get himself exposed to the ice in Himalayas. Obviously not well dressed for that. So the aim of the first expedition was to evaluate hemodynamic response to high altitude and cold exposure and to compare healthy volunteers to Tumo practitioners. When I talk about healthy volunteers, they were really healthy, and one of the gentlemen had 2 trips to Everest. So they were basically more of elite athletes than what you would associate with a normal volunteer. So there would be attempts to understand hemodynamics of Tumo practice, so what's happening to the vessels of both volunteers and the practitioners when they are exposed to the cold, and therefore to discover how the practice prevents people from cold-related injuries. Our equipment was solid-state ultrasound equipment that was suited for high altitude. It was furnished by Sonosite company, and that was the only commercial participation there. We also have a Cheetah NICOM bioretin system, which discovers vasculature conditioned by by checking bioreactants, that is to say, the resistance of the body to electricity, which is largely dependent on the movements of blood. There's 2 American physicians, 1 Israeli physician, and 1 PhD in physiology that were participating in it. So the data collection at 18,000 feet, there were 8 practitioners of Tumo and 5 healthy volunteers. They were exposed to cold, and then the data was collected with passive rewarming to comfort in volunteers and rewarming by Tumo practice with exercise and visualization by the practitioners and subsequent data collection. So as far as bioreactants, we can see that number of measurements was considerable, and what we were trying to see is overall condition of vasculature with cold exposure and without. One of the descriptors of that would be so-called peripheral resistance. That is to say, in simple terms, that will be what will describe whether the vessels are dilated or the vessels are constricted. As if you can see in volunteers with passive rewarming, the peripheral resistance was without significant change, about 2,000 during cold exposure and during passive rewarming. As far as Tumo practitioners, however, the difference was quite interesting. One would expect that peripheral resistance will go up, that is, that the vessels will constrict during cold exposure and will continue to do so as long as the person is exposed to cold. However, we'll see fairly profound vasodilatory effect of a Tumo practice. That is to say, instead of vessels constricting, they dilate to a significant degree, and the p-value with relatively small amount of observation was 0.001. That difference was statistically significant. So what we demonstrated that though not statistically significant, the cardiac output was higher in Tumo practitioners as opposed to elite athletes that served as healthy volunteers, and that peripheral resistance was significantly decreased compared to normal rewarming in the Tumo practitioners, showing that somehow and counterintuitively, there was a significant dilatation of all vessels as to those who practiced Tumo for warmth compared to normal volunteers. After that, we attempted to take a look at specific vasculature, and this is a result of carotid flow analysis. Carotid flow, of course, goes to the brain, and interestingly enough, almost never changes under any circumstances. Even headstands and other practices that seemingly would increase cerebral blood flow, the blood flow to the brain, actually do the opposite. It's a glial mechanism and it's a demand-driven mechanism, and therefore it tends to be very stable and not affected by much of anything. But we could see, interestingly enough, that at cold exposure, the Tumo practitioner will have a blood flow of 700 millimeters per minute to the brain. But during the practice rewarming, when visualization and the exercises are involved, it nearly doubles, which would be a result that was quite astonishing. So looking at distribution of people, male and female, there's only one female and multiple males that had the practice. At cold exposure, carotid blood flow to the brain, 300 cc's during Tumo, 500 cc's, a little less. Here nearly tripled, doubled, or nearly tripled, up, in all to the p-value of 0.005, which is statistically significant, which is remarkable to see in such a small sample. So Tumo practitioners definitely increase cerebral blood flow to the brain. There might be an increased diastolic component, which makes it even more so, because in diastole, blood usually doesn't go to peripheral organs, but goes to the brain and kidneys only. It is very likely demand-driven, that is, there is an increase in brain activity and increased metabolic demands, which supported somewhat by independent functional MRI data. Echocardiographically, looking at what the heart is doing during the practice, we could see that median increase in inferior vena cava, which is the vein that carries all the blood to the heart from organs below the diaphragm, also is dilated, which means that not only there is an increase of blood flow to the brain, but also increased blood flow to the peripheral organs. And this is a picture of inferior vena cava here going through the liver, and you can see the same thing happening there. There appears to be some increase in right ventricular function, and that's easy to understand if the vessels are dilated, peripheral vessels that would require right ventricle to process more blood as it returns to the right ventricle and needs to be sent to the left ventricle and from there to the periphery. A picture of that happening for a picture that was obtained on the portable equipment at the 1,800 feet, 1,800 feet, actually 18,000 feet, I'm so sorry, of altitude. That seems to be a pretty good picture. We're not gonna just by that. There was no really much of a difference in stroke volume and injection fraction, that is amount of the blood that leaves the heart in healthy volunteers, but there was a significant increase in left ventricular function in Tumo practitioners. That is, that the heart was working harder to support the increase of blood delivery to the periphery. Here's a result summary with significant changes being in red. There was no real significant changes in healthy volunteers of anything. In Tumo practitioners post their practice, cardiac index went up on an average from 3 liters per minute to nearly 5. Heart rate stayed exactly the same, blood pressure stayed the same. Peripheral resistance dropped from 2,600 to 1,700, which is a profound vasodilator. That's something that you would see with a heat stroke. Carotid flow increased significantly on an average from 269 millimeters per minute per meter square to 445. That is remarkable increase of blood supply to the brain, ejection fraction, and that describes left ventricular function. And TAPSE, there is no reason to tell you what it is, but it describes right ventricular function. Both went up, and this is understandable, but because it needs to support the above. So thoughts and directions of further research. Certainly, it appears that the practice of Tumo breaks most of the things that we associate with a cold exposure. The cardinal cold exposure vascular response in normal people is vasoconstriction. However, in people who practice Tumo, there appears to be profound vasodilation. It's obviously an effect that is somewhat difficult to understand because you cannot dilate your own vessels. If you could, obviously people would never have high blood pressure. So there appears to be a control of vasodilation in that practice that is somewhat unique and probably neurohormonal in nature. There's maybe an increase in CNS oxygen demand, increasing in carotid blood flow. There's also interesting that most of human adaptation to cold occur with somewhat of a caloric restriction, and that's very likely why people attempt to preserve heat when quite opposite in Tumo, vasodilation would require a dramatic increase in caloric expenses in a practitioner as opposed to somebody who goes through normal adaptation to exposure to cold. So gentleman sitting under the ice here, attempting to practice, but so there is a little bit more that was done there, which is also somewhat interesting. In 2018, I wasn't there. In October of 2018, there was a study that attempted to correlate Tumo practice with condition of superior mesenteric artery. We were thinking that as long as the blood increases to the brain, there is also perhaps a further increase of blood flow to the splanchnic organ. And indeed, it appears to be the case to a considerable statistical significance after 100 probes that there is an increase in both systolic and diastolic flow to the mesentery, to the guts. Again, it appears to be that autonomic functions are being controlled, and it's very difficult to state of what causes it. But I also would like to point out that it's not really that unique as it appears. Certainly, if we eat a hot pepper, the ambient temperature doesn't change any, but vasodilation is produced and you feel like you're sweating. So perhaps the mechanism is not dissimilar that will fool the autonomic system into believing that it doing something that it's supposed to do. But that's just my little thought of how it's possible. Obviously, none of that has addressed the neuronal and hormonal mechanism of how that vasodilation was achieved. And this is the same Nicholas Roerich, The Mountain of Five Treasures, of which one is a wisdom, and hopefully we will acquire more wisdom as we study this practice further. And I would be more than happy to answer any questions if you have any.
Alex, I will just ask a few questions just to understand better the setting.
Sure.
Who were your Tumo subjects?
I would be happy to, if somebody else will have questions any further, I would be happy to answer them with personal emails. It was a mixed bag. There were there was 4 Westerners, and they were Eastern practitioners, whatever, I forgot the numbers altogether, so almost equal. I think there was one more Westerner. One of the Westerners spent about 20 years in Tibet. That was the lady, the female, in the monastery. So she's kind of in between, but that's a composition of 2 more practitioners.
Okay, thank you. You have not measured the temperature, right? What happened with the core body temperature?
We have not looked at core body temperature. As the study states, the attempt was just to look at hemodynamics, that is blood flow, and to see what's happening. Obviously, the vasodilation will cause increase in body temperature. The splanchnic or core temperature, there is an increase in splanchnic superior mesenteric artery flow, and that flow it's to 38 some degrees. So if there is an increase in flow, you cannot avoid but to increase core temperatures. So that's fairly obvious. There's probably increase in brain temperature as well associated with a high flow, though. It would be impracticable to check it. I would be happy to, if somebody else will have questions any further, I would be happy to answer them with personal emails.